Faction versus faction. Two opposing forces with ancient hatreds will stop at nothing to destroy each other. We've seen this before. Command and Conquer, Rocky IV, and of course, World of Warcraft. It's a tried and tested concept, good guys versus bad guys, or red versus blue, or however you want to look at it, making players feel like they have a crucial choice to make about their identity and development within an MMO world is, well, crucial. Picking between two established factions with completely different themes and histories, perennial enemies of each other, it just makes sense then, right? In many ways, the struggle between the Alliance and the Horde is the dominant narrative focus of World of Warcraft. But it's a sign of the times that even thinking about the faction war as central to the story of the game going into Shadowlands feels really weird and incorrect at this point in the life of the game, despite the marketing attempts and in-game intentions of Blizzard to shine a light on the faction war in Battle for Azeroth. For me, that definitely highlights how necessary it is for Blizzard to do something about the two faction setup of the game going forward. But how did we get from a game where the focus on playing as part of the Horde or the Alliance was such a beloved element of the game which players treasured, to one where many players are questioning whether the game should continue to work on a two faction basis at all? I'm Vulgrin, and that's what we'll be exploring together in this video. The history of the faction conflict in World of Warcraft, and its status as a narrative centre point of the game going into Shadowlands and beyond. So, the factions then. Initially designed for the 3 RTS Warcraft games, plus the expansion Frozen Throne, the 2 core factions of the Warcraft universe began as fairly bog-standard good versus evil fantasy tropes. The Alliance was made up of noble humans, complete with knights, mages, clerics, and the other classic fantasy motifs. The Horde, by contrast, was the monster faction, as it were, made up of evil, savage orcs and other similar barbarian races like ogres, and later on trolls. Furthermore, the Horde's unit types included warlocks, death knights and axe-wielding grunts, very much in contrast to the honourable warriors of the Alliance. In Warcraft 3, probably as part of the preparations for the MMO to come, Blizzard started to really flesh out the factions and races of the game, showing different and far more nuanced and interesting sides of both the Horde and Alliance races and core characters. No longer were the orcs these mindless savages, but instead were honourable barbarians with an ancient and peaceful heritage, usurped by the evil demonic powers of the Burning Legion. Similarly, the Alliance was faced with the betrayal of Arthas in Warcraft 3, as well as the inclusion of the xenophobic and secretive Night Elf race to add some much needed variety to the cultural themes of the still fairly standard medieval fantasy-based faction. In short, by the time WoW dropped, Blizzard had done a stellar job of dividing the player base equally between the various interesting and unique features of the two factions. Want to play a heavily armoured knight using the power of the Holy Light to destroy your foes? You're playing Alliance. Want to work with the vast elemental forces of the world and commune with your tribal ancestors? You're going to play Horde. In the much more RPG-focused early era of World of Warcraft, a time when players really didn't understand the full scope and the limitations of the game, these narrative-focused choices really mattered. Not least because the nature of early WoW meant that cooperation between factions was minimal, and if you played on a PvP server, walking into an enemy-dominated zone would regularly mean getting killed more times than Ursoc. Too soon? I've put a highly accurate visual representation of the differences of the two factions on the screen for you here, which should clearly demonstrate why you'd pick each one. Now, I won't go into the lore history of the factions or the conflict between them in WoW, that's not what this video is about, and there are some extremely good lore videos covering that material out there already. I want to focus instead on the player experience in WoW when it comes to the conflict, and how that's shaping up into the next expansion and beyond. Suffice to say, the pattern has been fairly routine, with the only real exception being BFA, which I'll get onto. Essentially, it goes like this. An expansion starts with both factions either in some sort of hot war, or otherwise with a couple of important characters on either side wanting to put each other in the crippler crossface over some specific incident between them. You can slot in Theramore being bombed, Gilneas being invaded, Teldrassil burned, by the way the Horde aren't the bad guys of course, anything like that fits the bill here. We then go off to deal with whatever threat the world is facing, which typically will take us to an unknown continent or different planet. At this point, despite players stomping whatever it is we face every single time, there's this weird emphasis on the two sides needing to come together to defeat a common enemy. The Lich King, Archimonde, the Legion, the Zoth, all of it ends up going this way, inevitably. The weirdest part of this is how after these two factions start working together and manage to get stuff done, you know, like teaming up to destroy the Burning Legion as a threat to Azeroth, the single greatest threat to Azeroth, we suddenly end up fighting each other again, and in BFA's case, we end up fighting more fiercely than ever before. It really doesn't make any sense, especially when you consider that both factions are supposed to be federations of allied nations, rather than a single country with one figurehead. Really, really dumb writing, Blizz. Occasionally you'll get a major lore moment like the burning of Teldrassil, the bombing of Theramore, or the destruction of the Undercity, but the problem here is that same cycle we see with each expansion. By the end of it, everyone has teamed up to defeat the real enemy, and forgiveness is shown. You might get the occasional NPC comment or quest talking about how salty they are for X past atrocity committed by the opposite faction, but that's about it. I would say that the best the faction war was handled was in Cataclysm, largely because it was the first time that the faction war formed a major part of the current storyline, rather than simply being the overarching political situation in the background of each expansion. But what made it work in Cataclysm was that the individual races of the Horde and Alliance had wildly different approaches to conflict, both in their motives and execution. If you played an Orc, you could genuinely feel the difference between how the warriors of Durotar fought and what their reasons for doing so were, compared to the Forsaken, for example. Playing through the Silverpine Forest questline when it had just been released was, as an undead, great. I felt like it honestly reflected the way the Forsaken saw themselves and their reasons for being so expansionist, not to mention the clear hostility between Sylvanas and Garrosh, which served to reinforce the nuance of the conflict and of the Horde. It's a shame Blizzard didn't carry on with that kind of faction development. I guess they attempted it with BFA, giving Horde players some choice, which ultimately didn't do anything at all and was obviously just bolted on. Alliance players have got an even worse time of it, being the token good guys of WoW, which, moral high ground aside, is just plain boring. All of this ultimately comes to the gameplay element of the faction conflict. For me, the story of BFA is a complete mess. I'm a Horde player, I was apathetic to the story at the best of times. If I was an Alliance player, I can imagine I'd be constantly irritated by the way the faction is presented. But again, the story is only a small part of the problem. The bigger issue is how the faction conflict manifests in actual gameplay. Because, spoilers, it just doesn't, really. It's difficult to adequately explain why it is that players felt more aligned with one faction and antagonistic against the other in the early era of the game compared to now, especially when considering how much of a focus faction conflict played in the plot of BFA, compared to, say, Classic or The Burning Crusade, when it wasn't a major story focus at all. I'll give that explanation a try though, so here goes. Now, undoubtedly, the changing attitudes of gamers in WoW are a factor here for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there are less people who grew up on the RTS games before getting into WoW now. That animosity between the Horde and Alliance isn't really baked into their understanding of the mythos prior to entering Azeroth, and that will naturally affect players' feelings of the importance of the faction conflict. Another issue is that the world's lost its vast quality with the combination of flying mounts, smaller expansion continents compared to the base game, and the increasing availability of mounts and fast travel systems like portal rooms in your own capital city. When you think about it, you get a mount now pretty much for free at level 20. It used to be pretty difficult to get a mount at level 40, so it goes to show how much easier it is to traverse the world even at a low level. Now, whilst I'm not arguing that these features are detrimental to the game, I do think it's clear that the easier it is to keep yourself from venturing out into dangerous and contested territory, the easier it is to avoid conflict with the enemy faction. Coming back to the point of changing attitudes of players, I don't think it's false to conclude that players just aren't really as interested or incentivized to seek out the enemy faction as might have been the case in the past. The game in general has moved away from a focus on vast, expansive and slow-paced content to faster, accessible gameplay, which can often be queued up for in any location. This has also removed both the access to regular conflict with the opposing faction and also reduce the desire of players to go out of their way to engage in combat when there are easier and more rewarding, in terms of loot this is, ways to play the game which don't involve that risk. I've not yet touched on the impact the two-faction system has on PvE, but yeah, suffice to say that's basically the main reason why this is such an issue in the community right now. Remember what I just said about the accessibility being a big part of the current player's attitude towards what works in this game? Well, what do you think high-end players are going to do then, when one of the factions completely outstrips the other in terms of top teams for endgame content. Not good at all. So, is there a solution? Well, honestly, it depends on whether you think keeping the faction system as it currently stands is a necessary component of the game's identity. The way I see it, there are two ways to deal with factions going forward in WoW. Firstly, and probably more likely, Blizzard decides that there's no way that they can get rid of the two faction system, that it's too inherent to the game's identity to do away with it completely. I can definitely see this being the likely response Blizz would give to the players if there was a massive outcry for the breakup of the system. In that case, there definitely needs to be two major changes in my view for the factions to become anything other than a boring facet of the game that no one really cares about anymore. 1. We need to have our expectations subverted, but in a way which feels rewarding. I get that some players will be disappointed by any change or plot arc for characters, but seeing Anduin become a bit more grim and have to start taking some serious names, or having Tyrande go behind his back and start attacking the Horde, these would be compelling stories that players would enjoy. They've actually tried to do this in BFA, and I'd normally give them some credit, but it honestly just feels like any conflict in an expansion gets resolved by the end of it. Does anyone honestly think Shadowlands is going to have a major focus on the aftermath of the destruction of Teldrassil, for example? We're in the realm of death, fighting for our very existence. We aren't even on Azeroth in this upcoming expansion. There just isn't a sense of continuity there, just like with the Theramore storyline from the start of Mr. Pandaria. Going into BFA, those two were the big events which were going to be explored. Revenge for Theramore, revenge for Teldrassil. What we ended up with was Anduin essentially telling Tyrande he wouldn't help her get revenge for the burning of her entire country, and Jaina reuniting with Thrall because yet again, the real enemy requires both sides to come together. That's not a Jaina and Thrall sex joke. It's old, it's tired, it needs to change. Second thing Blizz would need to do in this situation then, this hypothetical where they keep the faction system going into Shadowlands and beyond, well, this is one about the actual gameplay, because ultimately the gameplay needs to come first. I might not like to admit it, but if WoW has amazing and compelling gameplay, I'm likely to be more forgiving with a lackluster story. It's a game after all, not a TV show or a series of novels. Gameplay-wise, Blizzard have to address the overwhelming advantage Horde has in terms of top-end players. It's pretty absurd at this point, when less than a handful of Alliance guilds find themselves among the best in the world when it comes to mythic raiding. Now, of course the game isn't all about mythic raiders and the highly rated PvPers, but there is undoubtedly a top-down effect when players watch streams or talk to their friends and see only Horde players because that's where the other high-achieving players are. Like I said at the start, this is a complex issue and the apparently obvious just fix racial solution really isn't so obvious. As long as Blizzard keeps the power effects of racials, that is to say, doesn't keep them around as purely aesthetic features like racial armors, mounts, effects and questlines, then there will always be a more powerful option when picking between the two factions. Balancing racials in order to make Alliance more powerful sounds like a good fix, but the buff would have to be very significant in my opinion in order to encourage the huge number of players who have switched to Horde or chosen to play Horde to start playing Alliance again, especially when considering how many of said players have paid real life money to make the transfer from blue to red in the first place. And let's just say for argument's sake that the mad lads over there at Blizzard actually do that and buff the Alliance racials through the roof. Who's to say that if a Horde exodus did occur, that we wouldn't just get the exact same situation as we have now all over again, albeit with a lack of Horde players instead of Alliance? That doesn't sound like a solution to me. The option of changing racials so that there is a focus on producing cosmetic gear, mounts and quests based on your race or faction choice does sound quite appealing to me as a substitute, especially because it would mean that even within your faction, you wouldn't have to say pick Blood Elf over Tauren for a more favourable racial ability for your class, let alone base your faction choice on it. But I understand that there are a lot of people out there who would be irritated by the removal of unique, actually useful racial abilities from the game. To be honest, I probably would be too. A really difficult situation then. Change too little and you won't get much change in the faction demographics. Change too much and you'll get a massive swing in the opposite direction that you don't want either. Not ideal. So what's the other path Blizzard could take then? I'm talking if they ever decided that the two-faction system wasn't working in modern WoW anymore, and was actively harming the longevity and accessibility of the game. We're talking really what ifs here, right? Well, I could see a few options. The first is that factions go, whoosh, straight out the window. Well, what would that mean? Well, for the story, it wouldn't mean a whole lot, because the player has always been aloof from the faction interactions when you really think about it. I mean, why was the Alliance in Uldia, for example? The answer is that they really weren't. The player was. I guess story-wise things could continue as they are, with more of a quest focus on the concerns of the different races, a bit like what I mentioned in Cataclysm. This is how some other MMOs handle things, like Guild Wars 2 for example. I'm not sure if I'd be into it personally, but it would solve the problem. The second option. The factions remain, but the player can choose at level 1 which faction to join, regardless of their race. I mean, think about it, we're getting a new starting zone for both factions in Shadowlands. It's not much more of a stretch to make it a neutral experience and then let you make the choice at the end, a bit like Pandaren. At this point, the story is so convoluted that this could totally work. I mean, look at the Horde. There are 2 different elf races in the Horde now, fighting alongside orcs and trolls. Is it much more of a stretch to have some humans in there, especially when it's ultimately down to the player to decide what the backstory of their character is? I don't think so. This would bypass some of the rigidity of the faction conflict in the story too, but again, I'm not too into the idea, as I think it would possibly make Warcraft feel even less like its original incarnation if the Horde and Alliance lost all sense of the racial component which initially defined the 2 factions. The final option then. I saved this till last because really I think this is the most likely option to ever be realised in some form or another. We keep the 2 factions, both story-wise and gameplay-wise, but players have some cross-faction grouping ability, essentially allowing you to do PvP and dungeons and raids with members of the opposite faction. This would be cool if it could be implemented right, and would certainly make it more accessible for players to interact and adventure with their friends on the other faction, without getting into the awkward hassle of one side re-rolling to the opposite faction. It did also get rid of the Horde and Alliance faction imbalance for raiding, but only on the surface. You see, the problem here would still be that unless the Alliance racials got buffed, then top players would still pick Horde even if they could raid with their Alliance friends, so probably not a solution at all then. Well, we've muddled through it. The looming, ever-present, always worsening faction system. They don't really make much sense in the story of the game, and they actively hamper the experience of many players. It's crazy to think how much money must have been spent by players having to re-roll from the faction they actually wanted to play on, because it's just objectively worse at the content they play the game to engage with. Really bizarre to think about that. But I'm honestly unsure what the solution is. Do we just get rid of factions? Will that ever really happen in a game where the developer actively markets expansions based on said factions and loyalty to them? I don't know. I'm not even sure if I'd want to play a WoW without some sense of an Alliance and Horde conflict, but then again, the Horde I loved, the Horde of noble savages, shamans and tribal alliances, isn't what I see when I walk into Orgrimmar now, but perhaps that's a topic for another video. That's all I've got for today. What do you think about the faction situation going into Shadowlands? Is there even a solution? Let me know if you like, and if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more. It'd be great to have you back. I'm Vulgrin, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.